But let's go ahead and get started. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services each semester. We schedule a series of lectures that focus on a theme, and this semester we're taking a closer look at World War II. Today's presenter is Louis Fucilla. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at UW-Whitewater. His research focuses on the role of public administration in American democracy, with a particular interest in the causes and consequences of trust in government. He is a transplant from Bloomington, Indiana, and is enjoying exploring the many wonderful things that life in Wisconsin has to offer. Please welcome Dr. Louis Fucilla.
Thank you. Everyone hear me? Good? I was going to say I'm relatively recently new to Wisconsin, but if they told me it would get this cold in March, I would have said no and looked for that job in Florida. But I'm no. I love the state. My dad's from here, so it's fun to be kind of back home in a home. I came up visiting as a kid. So this will be a little different lecture than maybe others in the series, is that we're going to use World War II as a pretext. But I'm really going to focus on domestic politics because I think there's a really interesting story here that tells us about the state of politics today that we see first emerging really in these elections way back in the 1940s. So I'm sure I don't need to tell you that politics is more polarized. We have more conservative Republicans and more liberal Democrats. The two parties don't get along. They don't agree on a lot. And they've sorted over time. Well, if we look back to it, we can see the start of this sorting really working itself out in these crucial elections. And so that's what I'm going to talk about and put those elections into the context, talk about some of the characters involved, talk about where there were tensions within the parties, and compare politics as it existed in the late 1930s to where we have now. So that's kind of the broad outline of the talk here. So let's put this into context. First, let's talk about domestic context, which is what is the state of the nation during Roosevelt's terms, right? So he's first elected in 1932, successfully reelected in 1936 for a second term. But, domestically, we are recovering from the Great Depression. So this is a graph of the unemployment rate. So even in the midst of Roosevelt's, second reelection attempt in 1936, employment is only at about 15%. Only, right? It's about 3% today. So this is substantial levels of unemployment still, and the massive impact of the Great Depression. I mean, so much so that a lot of these federal government programs would, hire artists or other photographers to go out and capture. And, this is from my home state of California. This is a woman who migrated from Oklahoma out with for the prospect of getting a better job. And if you think about the condition, she's basically living in a shanty. This is in America in, the 1930s. There's the Dust Bowl going on in Oklahoma. So we are not doing well. Things are not good domestically. We're still struggling. Much more so than we are today. But this is also a period characterized by dominance of the Democratic Party. Roosevelt wins a crushing victory over Kansas Governor Alf Landon in 1936. He wins by over 10 million votes, and it's an electoral college blowout. Someone asked me before, they said, well, what's the biggest, who's lost by the most in the presidency? And I'm like, well, that's a good question, because it would depend how you count it. This is probably more vote-wise, but I think Ronald Reagan's reelection victory over Walter Mondale, Mondale only carried one state. So it depends how you count it, but this is a big, big win. If we look at what's going on in the Congress, is that we see Democrats take over both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate starting in 1932, and they get progressively huge margins in both chambers. Really, the low point for Republicans comes in 1936, the election in 1936, which is for the 75th Congress, and there, right, Republicans are down to 17 senators in the U.S. Senate. There was only 96 at the time. We hadn't admitted Alaska and Hawaii yet. This is a small, small percent. And they're only down to 88 representatives in the U.S. House. Right? So they've been decimated as a party. This is an era, again, of Democratic dominance. Now, to be fair, Republicans do win back some seats, but they're still very much a rump opposition force in both chambers. So again, Democratic dominance over this time period. But we also know there's a context in the late 1930s, which is that the world is on the brink. And Americans, particularly American politicians, are very much aware of what's going on abroad. So we have the Second Italio-Ethiopian War, that's in 1936. There's the Second Sino-Japanese War, where Japan invades China. That's in 1937. And of course, there is Hitler and what's going on in Europe. This is from the conference in Czechoslovakia. They kind of invaded under the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia. And essentially, the president of the republic surrendered. This is at the conference where they had to look nice and make it look like. So all of this is going on, right? That's influencing American political discourse. What's America doing in the 1930s? Well, not much. In part because they're held back by congressional consensus that we don't want any involvement abroad. That was the lesson politicians had learned from World War I, which was, foreign entanglements are going to get us in trouble, and we don't want to be part of anything that's going on in Europe. So starting 1935, Congress passes what is called the Neutrality Acts, and subsequently keeps re-upping them through 1939 in order to really hamstring the administration from doing much of anything, whether that's sending aid or sending other resources to allies or preventing private companies from doing business with combatants. Right? We want to stay neutral. We want to stay out of it. This was, there was a bipartisan consensus on this. It wasn't one party or the other. Certainly Republicans had been against foreign entanglements. They had shot down Woodrow Wilson's goal of joining the League of Nations in the 1920s. But this middle cartoon, there's two guys that are riding an ostrich called Dying Isolationism, and the names on them are Nye and Wheeler. Nye was a senator from North Dakota who was a Republican, and Burton Wheeler was a Democrat from Montana in the Senate. So it was bipartisan consensus that we don't want any involvement. And just if I don't know if you can see the names, these were from a cartoonist called Theodore Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss. And so there's actually, if you look, the University of California at Santa Barbara has stuff that's available online called Dr. Seuss at War. Quite interesting, lot of satire that you don't necessarily associate with green eggs and ham. But some of these are very biting commentary on this. So the one at the end is, you can't read the script. It says, "'Tis Roosevelt, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." And the guy's wearing a sash that says Lindbergh. So very pointed that there was a lot of criticism of these acts on moral grounds that, look, we can clearly distinguish that some of these parties that are in conflict better represent American values than others, and that it's pointless to hold us back. But these were acts that, again, really held the Roosevelt administration, who wanted to be more interventionist, from getting involved. And really, it was only with the bombing of Pearl Harbor that America finally gave up its policy of neutrality. But I just add this as context for what's going on. But again, right, that ends. Hitler invades Poland in 1939. He invades France and Belgium in the spring of the next year. All of this is going on when we are holding a presidential election. There are presidential primaries that are occurring as tanks are rolling across France and Belgium. So just to give you that sense, and what we know from political science, right, primaries don't just start when people start going to the polls and having votes. There's a lot of stuff going on before that. So when candidates are thinking about running, they are aware of this context, right? So those folks back then knew what was going on, and this is informing how the candidates are going to approach issues. Just something that I think is interesting, and it's worth bearing in mind, at least when I tell you the story about the Republican convention in 1940, is that the primary process that we know and love so much from today was very different back then. So today, most states have what we call direct presidential primaries. I know Wisconsin does, right? So we show up to our polling places or get an absentee ballot. We vote for one party or the other, right? We cast our vote, it's counted, and then the candidate that has the most votes wins in that state. The state's delegates at the national convention are pledged to them. And most states do this, right? There are a few states that have the exception where they have a caucus, right? There's the Iowa caucus. I think Nevada also has a caucus. Back then, the process worked very differently. So let me just give you an example. Looking at 1940, so the primaries start in March of that year. And in the Democratic primary, 13 states have a direct primary election, Wisconsin being one of them. But there's little indication that those votes are formally pledged to a delegate, meaning that when the delegates show up to the convention later in the summer, be it Democrat or Republican, they're kind of free agents. They can do what they want. So great, you won the Wisconsin primary, but you still had to fight for those delegates at the convention. And really what's influential here is that it's the state parties that are influential in shaping how their delegates are going to behave. So, okay, this candidate won the primary, so maybe on the first ballot of a convention, we'll vote for them. And if they don't have a majority at the end of the first ballot, well, tough. Then we're free agents and we can do whatever we want. Our presidential primaries are much more like regular general elections, or like whoever gets the most votes gets the most delegates. And then, our national conventions are horse and pony shows where we crown the person that won throughout the primary season. And there's never really any talk of voting going beyond more than one ballot, right? So you won, convention is here to put the crown on you. Where, back at this time, conventions are rough and tumble affairs. And so this, you can have the presence of what we call dark horse candidates that seem to come out of nowhere and are suddenly the nominees of major parties. Hint, hint, we're talking here. So let's talk about the Democrats. So the Democratic Party at this time is a big tent party, meaning there are lots of different people that are Democrats with a lot of different interests. And that pretty much the only thing that unites them is their party label. So this is a picture of a guy, I would call him an example of a traditional Democrat. So he's white, he's from the South, tends to be more conservative, historically been a Democrat. His, parents, back many generations were probably Democrats. So this guy is Rush Drew Holt. He's from West Virginia. If you look at the data, during the 75th Congress, which ran, again, from 1937 to 1939, he is the most conservative Democrat in the Senate. Senator Holt is so conservative that there are only 6 Republicans that are more conservative than him. And his rate of party support, the rate at which he votes in line with his party, is 33%. Meaning, right, so he's defecting a lot to vote with the Republicans in the Senate. So in essence, they said, look, at this point in time, the Republicans are really this rump force, just as their party, but there's a whole group of senators like Senator Holt that are perfectly willing to break with their party on issues and to vote with them. Just to say, look, we're not voting these crazy New Dealers, we're voting the way we traditionally have. But why I say the Democrats a big tent party is they're starting to build, they did put together, to win successfully in 32 and 36, they built a big coalition. So the Democratic Party at this time is the party of Catholics. Every year, kind of at the end of the presidential election season, I don't know if you guys know, there's what they call the Al Smith Dinner that's held in New York. Al Smith, governor of New York, Democratic nominee in 1928, first Catholic to run for the presidency. And so through effort of men like him, they brought other Catholics into the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is also increasingly the party of African Americans. And this is shifting, but African Americans are coming home or coming into the Democratic Party. The Republican Party had always been the party of African Americans. They were the party of Lincoln and liberation. Well, there was enough messaging that, look, the party isn't responding to your needs, and so they were open to being brought in as Democrats. Then there's, intellectuals are increasingly Democratic. Kind of we still see that, or that's at least the charge made to this day. Those darn liberal academics, right? And certainly, right, suburban factory workers or organized labor was part of the Democratic coalition. And so some of these groups are pushing for more progressive policies, more government involvement, in the economy. And there are these traditionalists like Senator Holt that agreed to go along with Roosevelt's extraordinary response to the Great Depression simply because it was extraordinary. Right? We'll agree to more government intervention for a limited time period, purely for the sake of the economy, and then that's it. That's our level of commitment. And so as, Roosevelt goes on with the New Deal, tries some more outlandish things like court packing, these conservative Southern Democrats are the first to kind of say no. And so their connection to the Democratic Party is tenuous, or there's cracks in this coalition that, again, had been enormously successful. But we're starting to see these fissures here. And in 1940, there's a challenge to Roosevelt, and a serious challenge. This man who's pictured is his own vice president, John Nance Gardner, and he represents the traditionalist wing of the Democratic Party. Again, he's a white Southerner. He's from Texas. Has the distinction of being only one of two men in American history to have been both the Speaker of the House and Vice President. Picked to be Vice President in part because he unified the party in 1932. Right, he brought together those traditional wings. He brought together, Roosevelt brought the more liberal elements of the party. And so this is a balanced ticket, and everyone was happy. Well, over the course of FDR's second term in 1936, there starts to be some tension between the two men. That Gardner gets upset with Roosevelt's inaction over labor strikes. So there's the Flint sit-down strike. Gardner's actually an advocate of sending in federal troops to deal with the striking car manufacturers. He opposes Roosevelt's deficit spending. He opposes and actively helps to scuttle Roosevelt's court packing plan. So the two men have significant policy disagreements. And ultimately, he decides to take a run for the presidency. And also, if you look at it, he wasn't a big fan of the vice presidency in general, which I might phrase this a little differently. But, when I'm sure it works if you're from Texas and you have a homespun sense of humor. But when I do teach American government, they say, well, are we going to talk about the vice presidency? My response is no. We're not going to talk about the ultimate backup catcher. It's just not. There are other things we can talk about. So we're gonna talk about that on the 2 days I have to talk about the presidency with you. So again, he doesn't think much of it, but he again has these important policy disagreements that lead him to mount a challenge. Now he doesn't get very far. Roosevelt's enormously popular. But notice there's this tension that's bubbling up within the party. And it's a tension over what values or policies are we going to pursue. And there's that tension is going to lead to some stuff down the road. The other thing, right, this is notable, is that Roosevelt decides to break the norm on only serving 2 terms. That every president since George Washington had abided by this informal norm to only serve 2 terms in office. And I tried to look, I know there's it's often attributed to Washington, but I don't think there's any evidence that he actually said, 2 terms is enough for any man. So I think that's apocryphal. But there was a sense that he's like, in reality, Washington kind of saw the rise of political parties and said, I don't want to deal with it. So twice, that's fine. But I think I'm looking at this and I would have to decide what party I wanted to run on. And then I think people that I was formerly friendly with would be, we would have this tension, and I didn't sign up for that. So I think for him, it was more about the rise of political parties and setting a time limit. But that stuck. There had been a few presidents that had floated trying to flout this convention. I think U.S. Grant was one of them. But everyone eventually kind of came in line and said 2. Well, Roosevelt said, why not? Right? Let's push it. And so, even in January of 1940, there's some evidence that he's telling his wife, no, I'm not going to do it. There's evidence of him telling staff, no, I'm not going to run for a 3rd term, encouraging them to seek their own presidential bids. So it seemed to be something that he toyed a bit with, but had said no. So much so that at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in July of 1940, the chairman of the convention read a statement that basically said, look, delegates to the convention are free to vote for whoever they choose. The president has not put his name up. So it was a statement kind of saying, oh, I'm not really a candidate for office, kind of, sort of. But at the same time, the chairman of the convention read this statement, I guess from the back of the room, there was this loud shout that said, "We want Roosevelt." And I guess the convention just, at that point just got crazy. And, there was a wave to go and push him and make him the nominee. Well, it turns out the person yelling was the head of public sewers in Chicago, who they think it was some coordination between the mayor and Roosevelt to kind of gin up support for a third run. So, again, he breaks this norm. Why? Well, I think part of it is those intra-party dynamics, that he's worried that there are going to be other Republican or other Democrats that are going to continue with his New Deal policies. Right? He visibly broke with his vice president over his policy, and so I think there's some concern that they're going to carry it out. And then also, I think Roosevelt was a savvy politician, or he's astute enough to read world affairs and say, there's stuff happening, right? I'm concerned for what's going to happen. I can see these forces that are marshaling in Asia and in Europe, and I'm worried about the state of the country. And, there's a certain amount of hubris in it. So I always say presidents, should always have, presidents or presidential candidates, I'm always surprised that they can walk through doors. You think their heads would get stuck, because it does take no small amount of chutzpah to think you can run for president of the United States. But he thought he was the person to lead. In part, I think to answer that question, why, you have to look at what's going on in the other party. So let's look over at the Republicans in 1940. And so here are the three leading contenders. There's Robert Taft, who's a senator from Ohio and son of William Howard Taft. There's Arthur Vandenberg, who's a senator from Michigan. And someone whose name, obviously, you'll be familiar with is Thomas Dewey. Then a district attorney in New York who had made his name prosecuting mafia figures. Lucky Luciano was one of his big convictions. And each of these had support within the party. Robert Taft kind of comes from the more conservative end of the party. He's definitely an isolationist, and he's very much against any form of involvement in what's ever going on in Europe, and he wants to keep the US out. So he kind of represents conventional mainstream thinking within the Republican Party at this time. Thomas Dewey is a young man. He was only 38 when he was running. So he was young. And he was less isolationist than the other two, but certainly an advocate for non-interventionism. And then there's Arthur Vandenberg, who is trying to position himself as somewhat of a compromise between these two, right? So you don't like isolationism and you don't like non-interventionism and you want a middle ground, here I am. So those are the three leading contenders, right? So one, is probably, we have concerns about foreign policy and the direction of going that. Another is too young and may not have enough foreign policy chops. And then nobody likes the consensus candidate, right? There's less, if you're running in the middle, it's hard to make a name for yourself, right? So these are the three leading contenders going into the Republican primaries. But there's some guy who's kind of stalking outside of that. And there's Wendell Wilkie. And I'll point out, and I want to be very clear about this, is that yes, he's a dark horse, but he's one that was working on this for a while. So Wilkie is someone who supported Roosevelt in 1932. He had actually been a nominee to the Democratic National Convention. There was some talk of him possibly running as a Democrat to replace Roosevelt. His assessment, which proved to be very accurate, is that Roosevelt wasn't going to go. And he thought his best ticket to run was as a Republican. So he actually switched his party affiliation. And, you know, he had selectively opposed some New Deal policies, but hadn't been blanketly opposed to every element of the New Deal. And, you know, if we can say what factors what brought him his profile, well, one is that he had a lot of support from the media. And as you can see, this is a time profile, again, in the summer of 1939. So it wasn't like he was just sitting at home writing letters to the editor hoping to get noticed. He was out there cultivating a public profile. And, you know, there were newspaper editors from around the country that found him appealing and pushed his cause. Again, he was a policy moderate. He was not deeply conservative, and he did support some elements of the New Deal. So he was viewed by that more liberal wing of the Republican Party, which there used to be, as someone they could rally their support around. He was a little older by 10 years than Thomas Dewey, so he kind of took that advantage of, look, I've had more time. You know, I'm not this young man, although I look at 38 and I'm like, that's not so young anymore, but maybe that was looked at that time, you know, you're too young. Of course, when I passed my 30s, you know, then I'm like, oh, okay, you know, it's shouldn't be a crack against anybody. But he was a little older. And then one of the key elements that really distinguished him is that he went out and pushed for public support for the Allies, right? So he agreed with Roosevelt on that key element that we need to be involved in this conflict, right? There are forces involved that are antithetical to American values, and us sitting on the sidelines is no good. And so the path he crafted was one that, you know, avoided all the weaknesses of the other leading contenders. And so, you know, I'll show you this, and it's really interesting. And so Dewey goes into the Republican convention the front runner, that he secured some, but not all of the votes needed to be the Republican nominee. So he's going into so what you needed at this time, you needed 1,000 votes in the National Convention, and Dewey thinks he's locked up about 300 of them. So he needs 201 more, and he is the Republican nominee. And so I can just show you the balloting that went on at the National Convention. Now, there have been conventions in time that have gone hundreds of rounds. This lasted 6, but it's telling. So this is the first round of balloting. Dewey's gets 360. That's really good. Taft gets 189. Vandenberg, for again, a consensus candidate, is hoping he's going to win it over the long haul. And then there's Wilkie sitting there at 105. Not looking too good. And so, but no one has enough needed to win, so they take a second ballot. And Dewey's support starts to fade. A little bit at first, right? But you see all of these defections moving towards Wilkie, right? We're going. By the third round, you know, Dewey's hanging on, and then it flips in the 5th round of voting. And then you have your Republican nominee, who's Wendell Wilkie, right, that no one saw going into the convention would be the nominee. So, right, it's this dramatic thing. You know, he emerges out of nowhere, except when you realize, no, he was courting this. That he had spent a good number of years and a good amount of effort to set himself up to be the Republican candidate for this election. So yes, amazing dark horse story, but I think it's a little overblown because he was a savvy politician, and I think we do a disservice to his memory to just kind of say you were a quirk. So I'm kind of a hopeless fan of election propaganda. So as you can tell, a lot of this is policy disagreement with FDR, right? You know, you've moved too far in a liberal direction for the country, but there's a good amount of we just don't want you for another third term. So you know, two good terms deserve a rest. You know, no man is good three times. I mean, these are certainly interesting. The basis of the contest, which is like, look, you've been in office twice. Thanks. Time for new blood. How does it turn out? Well, we know. I mean, Wilkie does fairly well. He gets 6 million more votes than Alf Landon. But he still loses big in the Electoral College. I mean, he does better, but it's not even close. So even though there's this dynamic going on within both parties, Roosevelt's really popular. I mean, he's really popular. I think the American Republic is responding to what's going on abroad. They're responding to New Deal economic policy. And they vote him in for a third term. It's not even close. But those tensions are still there. And so let's kind of quickly go through 44. There's still some of these tensions that are there. So just again, context, right? The Allies are doing, by this point, fairly well in the war, right? They push back the Japanese in the Pacific, and they're making inroads, or they're preparing to make inroads in Europe. And as we know, and I always think this is interesting, is that both conventions happen after D-Day. Right? So literally politics is going on as normal here when there are, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans in Europe risking their lives. Right? So we're still holding conventions. So politics continues. FDR doesn't face any major challenge this time around. The people that disagreed with him didn't mount much of a fight. There's no record of a primary challenge. But there is disagreement on his vice president. And we again see this tension between the Democratic Party around, kind of more conservative Southern Democrats and more liberal Democrats. And so the person that FDR picks to replace Gardner is Henry Wallace. And he is not liked by this conservative Democrat faction. And they want someone that they think is more their man. And so they really push FDR to dump Wallace and to put Truman on the ticket. Again, Southerner from Missouri. There's actually some, I don't think this was part of the Dewey campaign, but there's actually, a thing that says vote Dewey, Truman is too friendly with the Klan. I think there was some evidence or some inkling on the part of these conservative Southerners, look, Truman's going to be better for us. And so, to maintain peace in the party, FDR dumps Wallace and, picks Truman. In essence, we do not have a President Truman had FDR not made this calculation, or more unlikely that we would. So this tension emerges. In the Republican side, again, similar names that we had last cycle. Wendell Wilkie did contest the nomination again. Unfortunately, Wisconsin took him out of that. He lost the Wisconsin primary where he thought he would do well, and that effectively ended his challenge. And he actually tragically died before the election in October. So he did not live a long time after this. Dewey really easily secures the nomination this time around. There's not the dramatic fight on the convention floor. He wins on the first ballot. But there's a split that's emerging within the Republican Party. That Dewey represents what we call, they're called the Eastern establishment. They tend to be, on social issues, more liberal Republicans, but fiscally conservative. And then those kind of more dyed-in-the-wool, consistently conservative folks. And they kind of split their support between General Douglas MacArthur, who was over in the Pacific, so he couldn't really campaign, and then Governor John Bicker, who was kind of tapped by Taft as his successor. And so to unify the party here, Dewey picked Bicker as his running mate. So again, there's tensions within both parts of the party, or both parties here, between different factions within it. Again, just kind of campaign stuff, right? So from the Democrats, look, FDR finished the job, even though he was very sick at this point. I mean, he was not in good health. In the mid-1940s, that over his third term, he got progressively sicker. So he was not a well man at this point, but kind of stay the course, right? And then I think win the war quicker with Dewey and Bicker. It seems like the consummate campaign promise that, no, I'm going to do better than the other guy, I promise you. And they did debate policy issues, but, Roosevelt still, at this point, the war is going well, and he's still personally very popular. Dewey does the best. So out of any opponent that ran against FDR, he only loses by 3 million votes, which is, I would like to lose a presidential election by 3 million votes. I would pat myself on the back and say I'd done a good job. But it's still an electoral college route. So that means, the Republicans are doing better within states. They're not getting blown out within states, but they're still losing them. There's, again, the electoral college is still pretty lopsided. So if I can get to kind of the conclusion here, which is, I've basically told you a story that there's drama going on within this, but then FDR wins easily. And the question is, why should you care? Well, and I'll tell you why you should care is that we're seeing the inklings of the modern party system. That's what's happening here. Now, it won't fully emerge until the late 1970s, right? But that tension that exists in this moment is the foundations of our modern party system. So we have conservative Southern Democrats. And what happens is they defect from the Democratic Party, they leave, they no longer think they have a home, or they're replaced by Republicans. Now, ditto for these Northeastern, or they call Northeastern moderate Republicans. They either leave the Republican Party or they get replaced by Democrats. And what this means is that this is the start, really, of our modern era of political polarization. And to just kind of bring it home, this is from the VoteView website. These are the guys that do, we call them nominate scores, but it's a measure using members of Congress's roll call voting behavior of how liberal or conservative they are. So the bottom line is kind of what we think of as classic liberalism or conservative, which is preference for more government involvement, which makes you liberal, or preference for less government involvement in the economy, which makes you conservative. And so this first figure is the distribution of roll call scores in the 75th Congress. And what you can see here is that the red dots are Republicans, blue dots are Democrats. There's actually the Progressive Party, which was started by Robert LaFollette's son, and was kind of like an alternative to the Democratic Party. But there's some red dots that are more liberal than some blue dots, and there's a lot in between, and they're kind of spread out all over. And this is, we think, more heterogeneous ideology and parties. Now this is just for the House, but now let's look at the House from the last Congress, so the one that ended in January. These are the ideology scores for the last House, the 115th Congress. So now we have tight packings of blue dots. So Democrats are more liberal, and they tend to stick together on this, and same for Republicans. And there are no red dots that are more liberal than any blue dots. We have ideologically homogeneous parties. So this phenomena, which has kind of bedeviled American politics, where parties can't come to an agreement, I think you can look at the 1940 elections as the foundation of this. And really, that's where we see the start of this polarization goes back to those battles then. So, you know, if you look at this, even though people are occupied by what's going on in Europe, and rightly so, or what's going on in Asia, there's a really interesting story about what's going on in American politics and how that effect is still living with us to this day. And so that's all I had, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, let's have some questions. Okay, let me hand you the microphone here.
Oh, thank you. Isn't polarization the worst kind of situation we could possibly get in?
Yes and no. So, so I will, as a political scientist, I will throw myself on my knees and say, like, we're partly to blame for some of this. At least the early political scientists looked at this kind of thing and said, oh, you know, it's terrible, right? People have a hard time telling whether a conservative is more liberal than a Democrat, right? And people have really mixed up views on American politics. And we thought this was a big defect. Well, in part, they were right, because if they're looking at this in, you know, the 1940s, right, there are some liberal Republicans. Well, we were like, that's terrible. And so we advocated this thing called the responsible parties hypothesis, where we wanted parties to be more ideologically consistent, to go out and contest elections, make it easier for people to understand. So I kind of get there's some argument for that, but unintended consequences, right? Which this polarization has had a negative consequence of driving people apart. And there's a really good article online in The Atlantic about political comedy. And so they had done a survey and ranked communities on political toleration between Democrats and Republicans. And it was a story about this town in upstate New York about how they were one of the most politically tolerant communities. Now it was noteworthy. So I think, yes, polarization is bad. There's some usefulness to it, though. And so it can't, I hem and haw a bit. But I think we're right to be concerned that we've reached a period where polarization has gone too far and it's a negative thing.
Well, with that polarization, do you see it continuing, or do you see it blending back together and as an independent liable to come in there and make some difference on this? What do you see for the future?
No. I mean, I think So, okay, on the hopeful side is when I talk to my students, right? These are young folks. All of them say, oh, polarization is bad, and we should have more moderation. Unfortunately, how that I think reads with them is that it's a slogan. What they really mean by that is, I think the other party should go along with what we want to do and stop complaining. And I've heard this from both Democrats and Republicans, right? Uniformly, they don't like polarization, and they want something where there's more, I don't know, moderation or more consensual process, right? Where we try to build agreement. That's what they say they want. I don't know if they can take the steps to get there, and I think that's what I'm worried about. I would hope we would have moderation within the parties, but that's I don't know. I still hope there would be Santa Claus. That was a horrible that was a horrible bummer when I found out the truth on that one.
Okay, here's a question.
Next, you're going to say there's no Easter Bunny either. No, my question.
I'll save that for later.
Okay. My question is, the founding fathers were looking at a two-party system. Don't we really have a four-party system, and is that why it's not working right now in Congress?
In terms of what four parties?
Well, the Tea Party and the traditional Republican Party on one side, the Democratic Party and maybe the independents or socialists on the other side.
So I guess I would just so the founding fathers, and I think this is a big flaw in the founding, really, didn't think parties would emerge. Now, in that, I think they were flawed in that they had experience in English politics, right? There were parties at that time that were contesting elections in England. So for them to say kind of la, it's not going to happen here, well, a little pie in the sky thinking, but okay, right? I'll forgive James Madison for that one. He did so much else. But in terms of the four parties, I guess I look at a graph or a figure like this, where, you have your outliers, right? Like you're on the left, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seems to be a committed lefty, and hard left. But and we'll see more as she gets more of a voting record, and that's why I didn't show the current Congress. I bet she comes in line, or more often than not comes along with what House Democrats want to do. And I think that's true also of Tea Party Republicans, that they'll make noise to try to win policy concessions, but when it's rubber hits the road, they come home. And I think we'd actually probably be better off if those factions did kind of exert more influence, or try to, push their leadership to do a little bit more. But point taken that certainly we do have more extremists now than we did, right? And part of that goes back to why we have polarization in the first place, which is, single member districts, first past the post elections, and these primary campaigns that encourage, candidates to appeal to the most rabid parts of the base that are going to go turn out in, a primary election, right? Which are really low turnout elections. People are just most people are just uninterested.
Other questions? Sure.
Well, wouldn't we be better off without a two-party system? Maybe have more parties, like a lot of places in Europe, and then you know what you're voting for. Because with Republicans and Democrats, they don't even care what you want, because they got a 50-50 chance of winning. And that, it'd be better if you had a Labor Party, a Conservative Party, a Socialist Party, and then their programs would be, consistent and
No, certainly that's to move to a parliamentary system. where you do have multiple parties, I think would solve some of the issues of polarization. Again, that involves, I always tell my students, like, because they're also uniformly don't like the two parties. I'm like, okay, here's extra, or here, I will give you an A in the course. You don't have to show up. If you can come up, here's exactly what you have to do. I talk about primary campaign rules, political, the role of money. I'm like, okay, figure it out. Go crack the monopoly or the duopoly. No one's taken me up on that yet. The only downside to parliamentary systems are multi-party parliamentary systems. Some issues with stability, right? That they can fail and you can turn over and lose your, can have snap elections. But I'm sympathetic to the argument that, look, to solve this runaround, we need not less parties or less partisanship. We just need more parties, or not just we can't solve it by just the two parties alone. So I'm inclined to say yes to multiple parties.
Any other questions? Sure.
It seems to me when you have polarization like we have on the right side up there, with an equal number of red dots and blue dots, you also end up with paralysis of government. Could you comment on that? And do you think that's necessarily a bad thing or a good thing?
So I guess I would say that the good or bad is going to depend on whether you want government to do anything or not. So if you don't want government to do anything, increased polarization is great because government can't do anything. But if you want government to do stuff, then you might be concerned. I know one of the early books on this that didn't look so much at polarization, but it said, look, even when we have a president that's a Republican, but either one or both chambers of Congress that's Democratic, we still lead legislation. We still see it emerge, and we still see laws get passed. And this is work by a guy at Yale, David Mayhew, and it was a book called Divided We Govern, right? So arguing that, look, divided government is still productive, or can be. Part of the problem is when Mayhew's probably getting his data, that, he's looking at stuff that's occurring as the shift is going on. So there's still conservative Southern Democrats, there's still some more liberal Republicans, and so they can still find room for agreement. But once that shifting has happened and we're at where we are now, there's not much room to do much of anything. But again, whether that's good or bad, I think depends on your own reference point.
And with that, we'll have to close down the Q&A part. But if anyone would like to stay over and ask questions of Dr. Fucilla, please feel free to. Otherwise, please join me in thanking Dr. Louis Fucilla for the lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you.